Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, like Hannah said, I'm going to be sharing the producer view of Eastern Red Cedar Control. I've worked with Extension and followed Rock Twidwell's work for 15 years when I was there, and then have served on the Sandhills Task Force Board and the Nebraska Grazing Lands Coalition. And currently, I work with NRCS and have been involved with partners to kind of make these complexes of cedar-free environments. So I'm going to find my buttons here. So for landowners and for renters, why is cedar a problem? And like Ray was talking about, we have different views if you're a landowner and different views if you're a renter, but really it comes down to what's going to be cost effective. And so I like to think of cedar any invasive like an infection. So if you get a cut on your hand and it gets infected, and ranchers are really bad about this. They get a cut, they don't take care of it, it gets infected, they go to the doctor, have to have some antibiotics. So to me, if you have to go get antibiotics, maybe it's over here on this screen. If you guys can see my mouse on the left, it's not a huge fix and it's probably cost effective. But once it turns septic and it's in the entire system, now you're in the hospital, it costs a lot to get it done. It's going to take more time. So on the right side of the screen, we kind of have more of a septic environment when we think about cedar control. But probably the biggest one um, for for landowners and for renters is, according to Brock Twidwell, you're going to lose 80% of your grassland production 35 years after you plant that first cedar. So when we start thinking about shelter belts, old homesteads, things like that that had cedars, it doesn't take long before you just lose all that grass, and it happens really quickly. So Ray talked about this quite a bit, so I'm just going to kind of gloss over it. But the thing to remember is landowners and renters have different goals. One thing I will point out is working with landowners, sometimes aesthetics is a big deal for them. So if the most cost effective way is to do a burn and leave those standing skeletons out there, it might not be very pleasing to the eye, and they might be upset with the result. So just talking about what's it going to look like, and what are your goals. The other thing, and Ray hit on this too, is who's going to pay for what, and what about those the labor and the time that goes into that, and how do we make that fair? So this is a picture of 4% tree canopy. Um, and once it hits this stage in the sandhills, we don't have prairie chickens anymore. So there's a lot of wildlife that's dependent on cedar control. But cedars have always been native. So they've been here, they're native. So how are they a problem? Um, Cedar trees are kind of like Goldilocks. They don't like it too hot, they don't like it too cold. So a lot of times they'll show up on those north slopes because they don't like to be on the hot south slopes. But the problem with them is that they're going to form monocultures. And regardless if they're native or not, they're going to form just one species, and it's just going to be cedar trees. And so that's why we have them considered invasive. And again, if you don't do anything, you're going to have that 80% loss. And sometimes it's hard for people to look at a picture like this and think, in less than 30 years, you only have 20% of your grazing. So the other reason I think we have a cedar tree problem, after World War II, everybody got Jeeps and everybody made them into fire rigs. And so then you had this rural fire department that put out fires really quickly. And I mean, fire kind of disappeared after that. So that's my personal bias there, that I think the Jeeps caused some of it. The other thing is our winters have changed. They're warmer. So cedar trees don't like super cold winters. So the farther north you go, they don't really have problems with cedars. And you can kind of see this happening. And Brock Twidwell has some great graphics and some websites that you can go to actually see it creeping up from the south, and it's moving north. And so, are we ready for that? And back, 15, 20 years ago, we were taught if you wanted to kill cedars, you just had to mechanically remove them. So if you guys want to type in the chat, you sure can. We're going to have these rapid fire questions, and just type in the first thing that comes to mind. So just type it in the chat. So to kill a cedar tree, where do you need to cut it to make sure that you kill that tree? So if you guys want to, I'm not going to give you long, but if you just want to type first thing that comes into your mind, where do we need to cut that tree to make sure that it's not going to come back, resprout? Okay. Yep. So we're going to cut it below the bottom branch. So we have to be on the trunk, but we're going to have to be below that bottom branch. And here's some pictures here that you can see. When they cut this one, they used they just kind of ground it down, but they left that bottom branch, and it doesn't look like a big deal now, but it'll actually resprout if you leave that bottom branch. On this one, obviously that guy, he's going to come back. So when we do mechanical cutting, we have to make sure we get below that bottom branch. And sometimes it's hard because that sand and that dirt will drift in. So I've actually thought about bringing Tordon. So if I cut it fresh and there's a bottom branch sticking out, can I go ahead and put something like Tordon on there to make sure that I get it? Because sometimes that bottom branch is below ground level and you can't see it. Okay. So this picture here is showing 15, 20 years ago, they actually clear cut this. So that theory, if we cut it once below that bottom branch and done, what happened here? How come it didn't work? And so we can use mechanical removal, but there's more to it than that. So here's our next question. So on cedar trees, what do you guys call these? And I have a really hard time explaining it because I'm afraid I'm going to give everybody. So just what do you call them? Berries, seeds. Yep. So that's what I call them. I think the official term is cones. So you think about pine trees have cones. Sometimes you'll hear Dirac Whitwell and the researchers talk about cones, and they're talking about seeds and berries. So that's the problem when we do clear cut. That's why it becomes worse than it was before. So you can see here, this was just a branch I brought in, but as I was messing with it, all the berries fell off onto the table. So I took a picture of it. But once those fall to the ground, just to kind of show you what a baby cedar tree looks like, this is a Lego doll here, Lego person. But I mean, they start out really, really small. So if you've never seen a baby one, you don't think you have them until you kind of figure out what they look like. So the berries or the cones are what's kind of causing that regrowth. So on average, how much is a cedar tree going to grow per year? So you can type in inches, feet, however much you think it's going to grow. Yeah, so on average, what the research shows, it's going to grow about a foot a year. I would say during drought, when I've went out and cut during a drought, you don't have hardly any new seedlings. And then that first wet year, they all come up. So, there might be some delays in there, but on average, they're going to grow about a foot a year. Okay, so this one, a female tree, once it's 5 years old, will start producing seeds or berries or cones. So you can see over here, all of these are more than 5 foot. And so if they're right at 5 foot, I'm sorry, I gave you the answer right there. But if they're 5 foot, they're going to grow a foot a year. So when they're 5 foot tall, so if you can look them kind of in the eye, that means that they're probably going to have berries on them, or the potential to have berries on them. And then you can see over here, they're spreading along the fence line. So that kind of brings us to the next question, which, when we think about infections, we talk about vectors, but who's spreading the cones and berries? and it's the birds, right? So they eat the seeds, fly over to the fence, hang out for a while, and then poop them out and leave. So a lot of times we'll see them along fence rows, under cottonwood trees, things like that. So kind of be thinking about, who's spreading these seeds as well. Okay, so this is my next question. So a mature cedar tree will produce how many cones per year? And I'm talking about the big blue ones that kind of look like Cookie Monster in the shelter belt. I mean, they're just bright blue and they're covered in berries. So kind of those big old trees. But you can kind of pick them out. You're just like, man, Cookie Monster's in there. Okay, you guys are a little low. So actually, a mature cedar tree will produce between 1 million and 1.5 million berries a year. So I actually calculated out, we have a 20-acre pasture that we have cattle out in, or heifers, and there's 1,500 feet of shelter belts with 4 rows going through that, and they're all eastern red cedar. So I figured there's about 1,000 trees total, and if half of those were females, they would be making between 500 and 750 million seeds per year. So is it any wonder we can't keep up with them? So that was just a 20-acre pasture that I was looking at. So when we think about seed sources, what's happening is the birds are flying in, eating, and then they're flying out and again pooping those seeds out. But encroachment happens about 1 football field every year. So you can see, these trees are probably going all the way around, but you can see where they've really spread the seeds there. On this north slope, you can see where they're starting to spread them. But if you just have one shelter belt, if you just are able to control within 1 football field, it's going to make a big difference. So just think about that. Where's my seed source? And then most of my trees are going to be in that football field. You're always going to have kind of an outlier that you might have to chase down. But for the most part, if you can control it, a football field away from that seed source, you're going to win the battle a little bit faster. So we talked about cutting the trees and getting them below that bottom branch to kill them. But the seeds are going to fall off. We're going to have to control what I call the little guys that come back. And so fire is a good way to do that. But we have to think about how fire reacts. And so when you think about lighting a match or trying to light the wood stove, fire is going to move up. And so it moves up the grass and into the trees. If you think about when you have a match when you're little, you always light it like this and burn your fingers because fire moves up. So when we're thinking about burning trees, we need to make sure that we have enough fuel underneath those trees to actually light those needles on fire to get that tree killed. So if you have grass that you've deferred or not grazed and small trees, you can usually get a pretty good kill. Small trees are like when we were cutting the tree, if we left the one branch, it would come back. So if you're doing a burn and that burn doesn't kill all the tree, it could actually come back. So we need to make sure that we have enough fuel to kill that. On the big trees, there's something they call cut and stuff. So we can actually kind of cut that bottom row and then stuff them up into the big trees, and that fire will carry up through those. So those are things to think about. One thing when we do mechanical removal, you're going to have piles. You're going to pile these trees up and then burn them. And the needles in the cedar trees are actually very volatile, very flammable. But if you wait too long, those needles will actually fall off, and then you just have a bunch of sticks that aren't going to burn. So when you're going to go burn piles, you need to do that at least within a year after cutting. So if you wait 2 years, it's just not going to burn very well. And then you'll just have these big piles of dead cedar skeletons laying around. The other thing to think about is, as we're talking about burns, a big part of that is deferment. So deferment is not grazing. And if you're a renter and you're renting pasture and you have to defer it and not graze it to do a burn to kill the cedar trees, that's a loss of grazing for you, and for the landowner, it's a loss as well. But sometimes you need to pencil out, is it cheaper to do a burn now rather than paying to get it mechanically cut? And can we keep up with that many berries? So if you have shelter belts or neighbors that don't cut, you might have billions of berries coming onto your place every year, and you might have to do burns. So just something to think about if it's been overgrazed, or had really poor management on it. You might have to actually wait 2 years to get enough grass to burn your trees. So smaller trees don't require as much fuel, but if they start getting bigger, it's going to take more fuel, more grass to do that. So this is a prescribed burn that was done this March, and last winter was kind of the opposite of this winter. There was no precipitation whatsoever, and the wind blew the whole time. So you can see here, these are little tiny trees. They're probably below the knee, and you can tell it just wiped them out, right? This was a school section, so it's had some not so great management on it. So you can kind of see it's a little thin. And we actually had people calling because it was drifting onto the highway. The sand was blowing so bad, and everybody just thought it was going to be an absolute disaster. So then it rained, and by June it looked like this. So you can see, the grass came back. It has cover, and this producer isn't going to come in and graze it till the next month or two. So he's going to defer it till late July or August before he grazes, just because it has, it's a little weak. The grass will be a little weak from that burn. So you can see how it recovered. But yeah, we were a little worried in March that maybe we hadn't done the right thing, but the producer now says there's no wrong time to burn. Prescribed burning on large trees, this is a little bit harder. So you can see here's some little guys here, but really, hopefully this was taken before the burn so you could see that the grass would come up and kill those little ones. Over here on this side, there's just so much, the trees are too big. So if the grass, even on these, if the fire came up under here, it wouldn't get those branches, and those trees probably aren't going to burn. But you can see how they're just going to try to get rid of the little guys, and then go back and do a burn again. And I have photos from the Sandhills Task Force and Pheasants Forever and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, so the partners that help us. And so I just wanted to send a shout out to those people. So this is after. So here's some deciduous trees, didn't bother them at all. But you can see it got almost all the little guys, but there's a lot up in here, the really big trees that still have berries on them that are going to keep reseeding out. So they could come in here and do cut and stuff, maybe on the next burn, or mechanically remove those to get rid of them. But you can just see how good it does on little trees. And if they're growing a foot a year, these little guys out here were probably only 2 years old. So you really have to start planning ahead of time to get that deferment in, and then do the burn the next year before they get too big on you. Okay, so if you live in the steep canyons, and you can see here, these really deep canyons with trees in them. And then out here, it's just covered in trees. But you might have to do a neighborhood burn. So you can see the fence line going right here. And if I wanted to burn my whole pasture, I wouldn't be able to do that without going on to the neighbors to kind of go out and around and make it a safe burn. So down in the Lusk Canyons, they'll actually put together several neighbors so they can do these burns safely, but also they get better kills on it. And they'll actually go in and do interior fires to get that going a little bit better too. But if you have really steep country and you can't drive around it, then you're not going to be able to do a prescribed burn on it unless you can drive that entire perimeter. So something just to think about, getting your neighbors on board when you do that. The other thing to think about is if you're going to do fire breaks, what NRCS suggests and we're pretty conservative, but we want them to be 10 times the highest vegetation. So if you're out in a meadow or in a grassland, your grass might be 2.5, 3 feet. So 10 times that would be 25 to 30 feet. So you could mow a fire break 25 or 30 feet and be okay. But once you get into these big old trees, if you have a 30-foot tall tree times 10, now you have a 300-foot fire break in order to make it safe. So when you get in the bigger trees, sometimes it's harder to get those fire breaks. So if we can move it out here to where it's mostly grass and we don't have those really tall standing vegetation, then our fire breaks don't have to be near as wide. So that's more cost effective for the renter and the landlord. Okay, so you guys can put in the chat here. I've lost my chat. Let me see if I can find it again. What would you do on this one? So we've talked about some of the different things we can do. Or if you want to unmute, for some reason I've lost my chat. But these are probably 3 foot or less. Oh, there's my chat. Okay, mechanical cut, hand cut. Yep. So I don't know if you guys can see this, but this is what I use. They're just big hand shears. You could probably get most of those with something like that. Up here, have you guys ever cut these where the cows have rubbed on it or the deer? And they get kind of that big stump and they're really hard to cut. Those might require a chainsaw. I just have a little 16-inch electrical chainsaw that I use that works pretty good. But this would be fairly easy to handle with mechanical. Even if you hired a contractor, he would just come in and mulch these and you wouldn't have any piles. So they would just mulch them down. The other thing is, do you guys think these trees are going to have berries on them yet? Just looking at how tall they are.
I don't think so.
Yep, so probably not berries. So we can get them and cut them and we're not spreading the seeds. The seed source is going to be down here. And I know Sandhills Task Force, if you're in the Sandhills and you have shelter belts that you do not use, they will help you mechanically remove those, because that way you're getting rid of the seed source and getting rid of pretty much that infection. You're not going to have anything else. The other thing you could do on this, if this is something that's been lightly grazed and they're not going to maybe graze it till next July, you could burn this too. And work that into your system as well. Okay, how about this one? Nope. Okay, this is our north slope. I love it when people this is my pet peeve, when people cut everything but the north slope because it's too hard to get to. So what are you guys going to do on this one? Cutting stuff? Yep, so you could cut this row down here and then shove it up in there. Some guys will even bust hay. They'll take their hay busters and bust it up in there just to help that fire kind of move up. And if you wanted to, you could actually find contractors. This isn't a very steep slope. They could come in and mechanically remove that, put a pile down here, and you could burn it, right? So you could do that too. But what's the problem? See the Cookie Monster trees in there? As soon as we cut that, even if we burn it, we're still probably going to have seeds around. So even if we do a clear cut or do a cut and stuff, you might be able to mow around the hill and just do a little burn there, maybe 3 years after. So there's some limited research that shows that 90% of the seeds will sprout in 3 years. So if you can do that burn in 3 years, they're still small enough that you can get a good burn on it with a deferment. But hopefully you'll get a lot of those seeds with it too. And again, if we do cut and stuff, we're going to do it at the bottom of the hill because fire likes to go up. So it's going to travel up a lot better than it would traveling down. Okay, so good job on that one, guys. Okay, how about this one? This is what I call my septic picture. Like there's an infection and it's gone bad. So thoughts on what you guys would do with this pasture? I think it's a section. Okay, you could burn it. We might have to think about our fire breaks, right? Like how wide are fire breaks going to be, or could we maybe get the neighbors on board and say, hey, we'll cut the fire breaks? Yes, you hope it gets struck by lightning, does its own thing, right? Yeah. So again, this one is hard, right? Because it's going to be expensive to do. You can do a clear cut. The pictures we looked at before, the 4% tree canopy, back in the fall of 21, those were bid for less than $15 an acre to clear cut. This one I think was between 280 and 400. So you can just see the difference. And if it's a rented ground, then that makes even a bigger difference as well, right? Because it's just going to cost everybody a lot more. But probably the most economical thing to do would to figure out if you could do fire breaks. You'd have to defer it. And just looking at this picture, and it was dry when this was taken, but they might have to leave it a couple years to get enough grass to really get it up into those trees, or do a lot of cut and stuffing. But you could do that. And in the Lusk Canyons, they said after about 3 burns, these skeletons will actually kind of just disintegrate. So eventually you could get it back, but it's going to be a lot more intensive, and you're going to have to do those burns to try to get rid of the seed source. And it's going to be harder to kill the big ones. So this is a tough one. I looked at this and I thought this would be a great place to maybe pair out in. But you might, once it looks like this, you might want to start thinking about, can I find grass somewhere else? Because it's not going to be long before I'm at that 80% stocking rate due to the cedar trees. Okay, so one thing I wanted to talk to you guys about is there any way we can put a rotational grazing system and use that to kind of help us do burns? So this is just like if you had a section and a quarter and you stocked it, so every month you would move. So a 5-month summer grazing, what would that look like if we wanted to burn one of those pastures every year? And the thing with deferments is, you've lost that income if you do that. So if you have a moderate stocking rate and do a rotation similar to this is what I came up with. And so you guys can decide. This would be a sandhills, a warm season dominated grasses. So they're going to grow a lot in June and July. The cool seasons like brome, it's pretty much going to have peaked out by June. And then it might grow a little bit in the fall if you get some rain. So I've set this up for a sandhills burn, but I personally like to have something to go back and winter graze. But what if we, instead of setting this one aside, what if we set aside the one in June and July and then burn it in the spring, and then don't go back into it until August or September of the next year? So I'm talking, we're burning small trees, so, knee high or below. But I think if you got it clear cut and kind of got it under control, you could set this up to where you could burn a pasture once every 5 years and, hopefully keep ahead of that seed source and those seeds that are dropping out. If you felt like you needed to burn more than that, then just set up your pastures where maybe it's a 3 pasture rotation and you burn once every 3 years. So I think this is kind of where we're headed. We've done a good job about, as grazers, to set up some of these rotational systems, but I think now we have to think about how can we add fire to that, and when do we want to do it? So the other good news is, I think last year, the organizations and agencies all got together and decided that you can now burn past May 1st. So you can burn all year as long as the conditions are right. So, thinking about, so when the conditions are right, you're going to have a burn plan that somebody's going to write for you. And if it's an easy burn, like a flat meadow, pretty much anybody can do that one. I can do those, and I'm kind of a beginner. But the real intensive ones, like in the canyons with the steep slopes and the big trees, you're going to have a planter that can handle that. But they'll say you can burn between this humidity and give you a range between these temperatures and wind speed. And so they have a prescription for it. So the problem with that May 1st cutoff is, you might have had 5 days in May that you could burn. And if everybody in the country is doing that, you just don't have the equipment or the help to spread around. So now we have the options to do, fall burns. If you're in where there's a lot of smooth brome, that might be an option to do, because you'll have that flush in the fall to kind of put some cover on the ground. And we've talked in the sandhills about doing them in late August, early September to, again, get enough regrowth to cover that throughout the winter. So just think about, is there a way I can do maybe some fencing and some grazing, and then it breaks it up into chunks. So if you're a landlord and a renter, you're not cutting it all at once. You can kind of do these in bite-sized pieces. So maybe this one I cut 3 years ago, or cut this one 3 years ago, 2 years ago, 1 year ago, and then you can just do a pasture every year. And so then I'm burning them 2 to 3 years later. But just think about, how can I incorporate burning or cutting into my schedule for that. And again, if you're moderately stocked, you might not even need a deferment. So we've seen some producers like that. So this is kind of like, you've learned it all, but where do I find resources? So there is cost share available through the NRCS, through EQIP. We have some working lands for wildlife programs in the Eastern Sandhills. So pretty much from Wheeler County over to like Blaine and Brown County. So there's options for that. And then Pheasants Forever, Nebraska Game and Parks, they're involved because the upland birds need that habitat. And same with the Fish and Wildlife and Sandhills Task Force. So, sometimes we're doing it for the wildlife, but what's good for the herd is good for the birds. So if you have good ranches with good management and no eastern red cedars, it's good for our grazing and the production, but it's also good for wildlife habitat. So these are people that I work with in the Eastern Sandhills, and we actually go out and do 75% cost share. The partners set up the bids. They have contractors come out and look at it. And so what your 25% is going to be. And that bidding process really drives down the price of the contractors that are coming out and looking at it. NRCS also just has flat EQIP rates where you get paid so much an acre to cut. Unfortunately, they don't pay very good on the low stuff. It almost needs to be a little bit more out of hand than I would like before they really pay a higher percentage on it. So if you can get them when they're small and little, I think it's worth doing that, even if you don't get cost shared, because it'll save you in the long run. Prescribed burning, I just wanted to talk a little bit about things that you would need. So the first one is a burn plan, and you're going to have to be able to drive the burn unit, the perimeter, because you're going to have tanker trucks with water on them, or little grass rigs with water on them to do your wet line. So once you have the burn plan, it's going to tell you, what to burn, when to burn, the wind direction, how are you going to do that burn? Because if you start your pattern the wrong way, you could start the whole country on fire. So you have to make sure you burn it the way the plan's set up. The local fire department will issue a burn permit. So the last couple years, it's a lot of guys haven't been able to burn just because they weren't able to get that permit. The other thing to look into is local burn associations. I know the Lost Canyons are probably the most well-known one. that got neighbors together and they do those big burns, but there's a lot more local burn associations popping up. And I think actually the Nature Conservancy and I want to say Pheasants Forever work to kind of to build those up. So if you have an area that you want to see that in, it might be worth reaching out to them. And here in the Sandhills, Chad Blado has been helping people kind of get started on burns and really walking you through the process and kind of taking you baby steps through that. So those are just some resources. I can give you names of people I work with in the Eastern Sandhills, but they said just to kind of list them generically. And then that way you can say, you know, you can Google it and say, who's my local NRCS office, who's my local Game and Parks person. And then they can hopefully help you out with some of that. So I'm going to leave you with a quote. My daughter said I had to leave you with this, but there was a Chinese proverb that I've messed with a little bit, but it's the best time to cut a cedar tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. So if you think you're behind, don't worry, just start doing something now. So I will take any questions that you guys have.
Awesome. Thank you, Bethany. Yeah, if you've got any questions, if you can unmute, feel free to unmute and ask questions, or also if you're a little more shy, feel free to drop them in the chat. It's a wide open here.
And if you guys have any great ideas for other things you can do to control cedar trees, I will take those as well.
I'm gonna grab one out of the chat real quick for you. Okay. So back whenever you were first talking about you know, basically size of tree and how much fire could kill, you know, X amount of feet of tree. Can berries survive fire?
So I think it gets fairly hot. So I'd be more worried about the ones that are maybe underground. So if they're still on the tree, I think they're probably going to go up in fiery hell. But if you think about the grass, that crown doesn't get burnt enough to die. And so if it's below that crown and kind of fell into the soil a couple years, I think those guys are still going to be in there. And a lot of times you'll see them, you know, pop up. But just so I just figured that windbreak that we have around that 20 acres that we calve out on, I thought it was going to be like 10 million, but you know, I mean, 500 millions, that's a lot. So I think there's just so many berries there that when you burn, it opens it up, that canopy up, and you've kind of scratched the surface of the seed. And so I don't think it's going to kill the ones that are on the ground. Yes. Oh, neighbors. So the question is, what do you do about neighbors that have cedars that contribute to your cedar tree issue? So pretty much they're the seed source, right? You've got rid of everybody on your place and now you're dealing with the neighbors. Yeah, so we used to worry about fences, right? Good neighbors had good fences. Really, the only thing you can do is get that football field and try to control it there. So if you can maybe just do, you know, little burns around there, or if you can, you know, people pay, I don't know how much to go exercise at the gym. I mean, take your hand pruners out there and just walk it every night for a couple hours. But yeah, neighbors and that seed source is going to be tough. And it's just something I think we're going to have to deal with either through burning or mulching or cutting. Yeah.
Bethany, I really appreciate you taking time to walk us through all this information. This has been really beneficial. One question I had was, we're out in the Eastern Sandhills as well. We've put a considerable amount of resources into cutting, you know, cedars and so forth. And as time's gone on, feels like, and maybe I'm looking for validation or maybe a challenge from you, is as we've paid people to cut trees and so forth, right? They'll cut them and then drag them, put them into piles. If as years have gone by, we've seen now where they've drug them, they've actually just scattered
the trail.
seeds.
Yes.
Yeah. So when it comes to mechanically cutting them or whatnot, are you proponent of just letting them lay there, or I guess how would you advise that? I mean, especially where you contract people, can you kind of help direct what they should or shouldn't be doing? So
Yeah,
maybe that's
and
my
I
question.
maybe have worked with the wildlife biologist too much, but I think if you leave those carcasses, the hawks are going to sit up there, and that's where they get a lot of the prairie chicken nests. So whenever we do projects, we try to just do a clear cut, and then know in 3 to 5 years we're going to have to do a burn.
Okay.
And as soon as you cut, you almost have to start planning. So year 1, you cut, year 2, you defer, and then year 3, you burn. And then that way, if it's dry and you have to push it back a year or 6 months, whatever, you're still getting them when they're 3 foot or under. And because once they hit 4 foot, they seem to be really hard to kill unless you're willing to leave a lot of grass under there. But yeah, my mom battled musk thistles her whole life south of Ord. And I mean, they didn't go away, right? They just learned how to control them. And I think that's where we're headed with cedar trees is there's no one and done. We're just stuck with them, and we're going to have to do it the best we can. But the ones that we've seen be really successful are the ones that do a clear cut, get rid of that seed source, burn. But then every time they burn, they might have to burn 3 years after, then it's 5 years, then it's 7, because they're getting rid of that seed source.
Okay.
And again, focus on that football field if you can.
Sure.
Yep.
Okay.
But yeah,
Thank you.
I've seen the trail. I know what you're talking about. You cut one down, 500 come to their funeral.
That's pretty good. It's very true. Thank you.
So the question I have for you, Bethany, have you, as you've dealt with landlords and tenants both, how have you seen any examples of rental agreements that include cedar tree control measures, like actually written out ones, or even if you've heard word of mouth ones? What do those look like?
Yeah, so we have one renter. So the estate, the mom died and the sons inherited the estate, and they had a cedar problem. They were cutting, but they didn't have the renter there to do the burning. So they have a brand new renter, and he's done a lot of burning, set up the grazing rotation, but he actually made the owners come out and he took them on a tour of their own place. And that was the first time in like 40 years they'd seen it, because they'd, pull into the drive and hit the headquarters, and that was about it. So they've been able to see the changes that he's made. And again, what did Ray talk about? I wrote it down. The non-functional costs are pretty much the costs that you're not thinking about. Because this guy had figured up if him and his hired men went out and burned the piles, how much it cost. We had to mow a fire break. We're going to do a burn on a section, and, broke the bar off because it hit a stump. So, there's things that you just don't think about that take a lot of time and a lot of frustration. But I think you need to think about those non, you're not writing a check for it, but what does it take? But I think the landowners in the example I gave, they see what's happening. And so I think they'd be willing to pay for some of those non-cost items, labor and such.
Awesome. Thank you. I don't know if you got to see in the chat, Miss Peggy is out in the Seneca area. They have a Still 240 weed eater and replaced a string with a 12-inch carbide circular saw. She upped your loppers by one.
Yep. Yeah. I was afraid I'm going to take my knee off when I'll be the one with the stump when I'm done. So, but I've heard people that have that. They put them on their four-wheeler, they just drive by and zip them off when they go by. So yeah, if you can find what works, that's great. All right. I think we're about out of time.
We've got about 4 minutes. So if anybody has one more follow-up question, we can nail that. I'll occupy you with this one. You did mention, I appreciate that you had your septic picture. You knew what it would cost to bid that out and actually what that was worth. what figures do you all work off when it comes to if you were to have to contract a prescribed burn? You know, we live up where fire is a 4-letter word.
Yeah.
So if you were to have a company come in because the neighbors aren't on board, what does that look like compared to mechanical?
So again, these are inflation, pre-gas prices going up, but I think the local group here was doing $20 an acre, and I want to say NRCS was cost sharing about 13. So, but they were bringing everything. They were bringing the crew, they were bringing the equipment. You know, they were doing it all.
Did they do the prep work?
No.
Okay.
You had to do the fire break and all that, but they would come and do the actual burn.
Okay.
The landowner associations, they, I think, do it kind of like branding, so they'll swap help. And I think some of those too will get grant money to get the equipment, and then you can rent it out if you're part of the association. So that's where a lot of the smaller groups are going to. But I only know of 2 guys, probably within, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours, that do burning. And when you're working with landlords and renters, and if you're hiring a contractor, insurance is always an issue that comes up. And I don't know the answer to that. They say if you follow your burn plan, you don't need extra. But I'm kind of cautious. I think I might, check with my insurance agent before I did something like that.
I have a question about the Sandhills Task Force. You mentioned they can come out and do some of that work. What do they charge, if anything, or what?
Yeah, so they're doing cost share, but it's a requirement that they get bids. So they will actually host bid days, and they have a list of contractors that they invite. Or you can say, these are ones I want invited. And so what happens is they'll come out and do a field visit. Sometimes more partners will get involved just because we can make our dollars go a little bit farther. But they'll come out and do a field visit. If they think it's a good project, they'll bid it for you. The contractors come out and drive around and put in their bids. And those are 100% clear cut. They bring the piles in away from the fence about 300 feet. So that way, if you don't get them burned, they can just become part of the burn unit. But after that bid day, they'll summarize those and then fund up to 75% of the cost. So right there, you know how much it's going to cost you. And some of the other partners do that too. So it's not just Sandhills Task Force, but I do like working with the partners, because then we can pool all the money together and do, bigger kind of landscape type projects. We love to do neighbors with neighbors. So, once someone starts cutting, if you can get the next guy on board, it just gets rid of that seed source.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I don't know if you just saw it pop up. They're going to kick us out. Bethany, thank you so much. This was awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, you guys.